A very good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining us today for the online seminar on sensitization of suicide first responder, specifically for medical teachers. However, let me tell you that this particular webinar may not be only be important for medical teachers, but everybody who has to interact with some or the other individual in their life. So though it may be slightly specific to medical teachers, but it will be also applicable to other individuals who has one or other interactions with another individual. It may or may not be in the capacity of a teacher, but maybe in the capacity of a friend and colleague, a boss, a subordinate, or whatever interaction that we have in our daily life. So, on occasion of World Mental Health Week 2021, Department of Psychiatry is celebrating the Mental Health Week 2021 with the Mind Mela 2021. We have been organizing various programs on each day, and for today, we have invited two very esteemed speakers, Miss Nyana Sabharwal, who is a suicidologist, and Dr. Avinash Desouza, who is an eminent psychiatrist. So, for today's program, we also have our very own chief guest, Professor Mrunal Phatak, madam. I think there is some glitch with the presentation. Slide is not changing. Just give me a minute. So our chief guest for today's program is Professor Dr. Mrunal S. Phatak. Dr. Phatak is a professor of physiology and he's been heading as dean for academic activities of AIIMS Nagpur for last 2.5 years. Madam is experienced teacher. Madam is a keen researcher, and Madam has also worked a great deal with psychophysiology and neurophysiological models. So over to you, madam, for your opening remarks for the day. Thank you. Madam, you are mute. Can you unmute yourself, madam?
Yeah. Am I audible? Am I audible now? Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Dr. Suyog. On the occasion of World Mental Health Week, I congratulate Department of Psychiatry AIIMS Nagpur for organizing such a great host of events categorized as Mind Mela 2021. This is with the sole aim of increasing the awareness of good mental health, right? So I thank Dr. Suyog Jaiswal, in charge of Department of Psychiatry, for inviting me to voice my thoughts on this great platform. Today's webinar on suicide prevention has eminent speakers like Dr. Avinash Desouza, consultant psychiatrist, Desouza Foundation, and Ms. Nyana Sabharwal, suicidologist, founder of Safe Space. I'm sure they'll be deliberating in detail about the suicide prevention and the measures needed for it. It is indeed the need of the hour to discuss this, which was so unheard of in the earlier days. With the advent of the modern era, the issue of suicide prevention has now come to the forefront. But what I always thought was why in the first place this act of suicide has ever evolved. It was not there when we were children, when we were small in the olden days. So maybe I would like to deliberate on the possible cause of suicide. So each of one of us, I think, we have a quest for happiness. In fact, our yoga gurus have been telling us that the very existence of our being is to attain happiness. Simple measures of life lead us towards happiness, but they do not give us ultimate happiness so that we are at peace with ourselves as well as with others. So I believe that if we are able to be happy, we will enjoy and value life. This, I think, can be an action plan to dissuade people from committing suicide. Seems quite simple, right? Ever thought of getting instant happiness with a click of a button? Or wouldn't it be easy to buy happiness if it was sold in the market? Well, we all struggle through many events in life. But if we keep searching for happiness from something or someone, we will always be dependent on external sources. Instead, if we believe that happiness dwells within us, we can easily achieve our goal of becoming happy. Happiness is an emotional state most of us desire, a state where we feel very positive, very relaxed, at peace with ourselves. Now, the Western culture sees the pursuit of happiness as the most important goal of life. Including in ancient Indian culture, the goal of happiness is not only happiness, but moksha. So we strive for moksha, where it is a state where the cycle of suffering stops. So ironically, as societies embrace the Western ideal and start to pursue individual happiness, then the rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide increases. The Western culture is more consumeristic and is fueled with the quest for happiness. Happiness is always concerned or confused with pleasures of life. So these small pleasures of life, though they are very good, they do not lead you to happiness. Now, in evolutionary or biological perspective, now I being a physiologist, I would like to say that it is an activity when the brain starts releasing neurochemicals such as dopamine. Or pleasure is also from stimulating the reward centers of the brain. But science and life experience tells us that pleasure doesn't always last. The novelty wears off. The brain does not produce the same surge of dopamine in the same amount. The reward centers adapt, and the person is compelled to seek new experiences to gain happiness. So I think I can't stop from speaking physiology on these aspects. But pleasure is a fleeting experience, and happiness is more subtle and lasting state of mind. Those who seek pleasure find only momentary joy, and therefore the dissatisfaction begins. So person's level of happiness is determined by variety of factors: his temperament, his genes, like which we cannot control, but of course his genetic makeup also determines his happiness, his physical health. A fitter person is more happy, a happier person is more fit. So it's a circle, it's a good circle. A healthy balanced diet, a healthy body. Meditation, of course, relieves the stress, decreases anxiety, and boosts happiness. Having social ties, feeling connected to others, having good friends, a lot of friends whom you can laugh with, whom you can share, who are not judgmental to you. It's a very great boon to lead you to happiness. To be real about the world, not be negative, and do not have catastrophic thinking. All this increases happiness. Now, work can be another very important ingredient to lead happy life, especially if the work is meaningful and challenging. Poverty is, of course, causes stress, decreases happiness, but excess of wealth can also lead to unhappiness. So you need to have a balance about this, and a balance between work and the rest of life is very important to attain happiness. So how can we be happy in a state of mind? First, I think that you should cultivate the habit of gratitude and contentment. The world we live in amplifies dissatisfaction. Many people compare lives with others, friends' lives, boss, the other people's lives, or people on social media, somebody who's a celebrity. This leads to a constant feeling that somebody else's life is better than ours. Being thankful and happy with what we have is the first step. Secondly, be in good physical, good mental health. Stay physically healthy and your mind will be healthy. Third, always be connected with others. Now, this pandemic has increased the isolation of the modern life. Authentically connecting with others increases happiness. Fourth, do something for others. Be helpful. Focus on helping others. This makes your life more meaningful, more happy. And finally, manage your mind. Learn meditation. Stay in the present. Stop worrying about the future and do not regret the past. I think this is what I can say about attaining happiness. I'm sure we have great personalities deliberating more on the prevention of suicide. But then if you're happy and at peace with yourself and with others, maybe we will not need these suicide prevention activities at all. This is what I feel. And I would definitely like to hear from the experts about what are their views. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Desouza and Ms. Nyana Sabharwal, who have consented to speak to us, and we are eagerly waiting to hear from them. And thank you so much. I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Suyog. Thank you so much.
Suyog, you're muted.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you for the insightful and encouraging words. Going to our next speaker, Desouza sir. And now again, I have some glitch at my end and I'm not able to change the presentation. Shilashmi, can you take over the presentation? Can you share the screen?
Yes, sir. Just a minute.
Yes. Desouza sir's introduction, please. So, Dr. Avinash Desouza sir is an eminent psychiatrist. He practices predominantly in Mumbai, and he has more than 2 decades of his experience. He has done masters in counseling and psychotherapy as well as MPhil in psychology, and also he holds an MBA in human resource development and doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Hertfordshire. He also runs an foundation called Desouza Foundation, which also not only works in the area of mental health awareness across all sectors, but also has a journal, Indian Journal of Mental Health, which also runs a journal, Indian Journal of Mental Health, which has a scientific publication. Dr. Desouza is also attached to Department of Psychiatry of LTMMC College at Mumbai. Next slide, please. Desouza sir is Associate Professor and Secretary of International Institute of Organizational Psychological Medicine. He is International Faculty for the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and President of the Global Society for Digital Psychology. As I already mentioned, he is Editor-in-Chief of Indian Journal of Mental Health. He has more than 750 publications in national as well as international journals and author of more than 12 books in the area of mental health. As you already aware, he is a very sought after faculty and professor at various psychiatry, psychology and psychotherapy training programs across India. And that is the reason we have invited him here to enlighten us about his topic on suicide prevention. Desouza sir, over to you.
Yes. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here. Well, when we look at suicide, I mean, I think I will start with something which is on a more serious note, and then we'll probably go on to suicide prevention. Suicide has always been there. I think it's been there ever since mankind was there. And I think one of the things which I would want to drive home, the first point that I would want to drive home is that all of us need to sort of rethink, what we're doing and why we're doing certain things, for the very simple reason that we do a lot of suicide prevention programs. We've done programs in schools, we've done programs in colleges, we've done programs in institutes and corporates, we've done gatekeeper trainings, we've done all sorts of training programs with teachers. But one of the things which is very important for everyone to realize is that in the last 100 years, right, from say 1920 to 2021, 22, suicide rates have never reduced. And that is something that I think we need to think very deeply about, that we have created so much awareness. We know so much about neurobiology, we know so much about the genetics of suicide, we know so much about brain pathways involved, we know so many things, but suicide rates haven't reduced. So that is something which I think, as preventive people, we need to think whether our preventive strategies are probably going wrong, or do we need to do something at a childhood level, do we need to do something at an adolescent level? There's something there which needs to be worked out. Like, one of the things I've always said is that if we teach mental health and if we teach resilience in school curriculums, we'll find that a lot of suicides can probably be prevented because it's just not taught. Mental health as a subject should be there. Resilience as a part of mental health as a subject should be there, so that when the child fails in an exam, he learns how to manage himself. So that when a child has a friend that rejects him, he learns how to manage himself. So that if he fails in a board exam, he learns how to manage himself. So that is something which is, I think, vital and very important. Another thing when it comes to suicide prevention is that I tell everyone that please remember that anyone and everyone can think of suicide at some point of time. We often look at a person and say, oh, that guy, I don't think he'll ever think of suicide. No. But the thing is, anyone and everyone can think of suicide at some point of time, because life can get overwhelming, life can get bothering, life can get worrisome. So suicide can, happen at any point of time. The thought can come to anyone, and no one is free from that vulnerability to suicide. So everyone is susceptible to it. The whole issue with regard to suicide prevention that becomes very worrisome and troublesome and bothersome is that what are we going to do to prevent suicide? Are we going to create awareness? Are we going to do workshops? Are we going to do other things? Well, I think the most important thing that we need to do is teach people to ask each other about suicide, which is not being done. So we feel afraid to ask the question. So tomorrow, if a friend of mine comes to me and says, I feel low, I feel sad, I look at him and said, Are, iski अच्छी family hai, iska ghar अच्छा है, मुझे नहीं लगता ये शायद suicide करेगा. We don't ask the person, do you feel life is not worth living? Do you feel ki I should end my life? Do you feel you want to just call it a day? No, we don't ask, because we get carried away by the fact that he probably has sought help, so he won't probably attempt suicide. So that's something to please importantly in your histories, when you see patients, when your friends come to you, ask them that very important question, that do you think you feel suicidal? That's which is something which is very, very important. We also need to identify high risk groups, which I think is a very important factor. And what do we mean by high risk groups? We mean groups that are more prone to a suicidal risk. Now, these would include patients with a psychiatric disorder. So anybody with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia is more prone to suicide risk. We could probably look at patients with chronic medical illnesses. These are people who are more prone to suicide. We could look at people with a past suicide attempt. They are more prone to suicide. We could look at people with self-injurious behavior. They are more prone to suicide. People with personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, they are more prone to suicide. So the bottom line is that we need to look at multiple people. We need to look at multiple groups of people who are at a high risk. The adolescent group is a high risk group. Even the elderly group is a high risk group. So we need to look at these issues. What's also very important is that we tend to neglect certain pockets when it comes to suicide. So rural suicide is not looked at, very encouragingly in our societies. The whole focus is on urban suicide. So there are rural suicides. I mean, you all are in Nagpur, which is very close to Amravati and Vidarbha, and we have seen a whole spate of farmer-related suicides that have happened. There have been a lot of interventions which have been done in that area. So we need to increase rural mental health awareness. And I think there was a program that was run some time back by one of our psychiatrists, which was called Jite Gao The Manosopchar, where wherever there is a village, there is a psychiatrist. And I think that's a very important program. So programs like that, I think, play a big role. And we need to make the most important aspect, again, then we also don't look at elderly suicide so much. The focus is more on adolescents. We don't talk about geriatric suicide at all, and what can be done to sort of prevent it. So these are pockets that we need to look at. We also don't really look at suicide prevention in a patient who has schizophrenia. For many other times, it's assumed, okay, he has schizophrenia, probably he succumbed to his hallucinations or whatever. So the tendency to not look at preventing in these areas is what also comes up. Medical students, and I think dental students, and these are also very high risk group, because I think they face a lot of loneliness. They're away from their families. They are overworked, and COVID has also created havoc. So these are groups of students that need to be looked at, and they can feel overwhelmed, they can feel upset, they can feel with all that's happening around them. So we need to be a little sort of particular, and we need to be a little careful about this whole issue. So this is something which is very, very important. I think one of the other things that when it comes to suicide prevention is, I think in general, we need to create a talk, we need to create people's mindset to talk about mental health, which they're not doing. So they need to talk about depression, anxiety, PMS without feeling ashamed about it. They need to talk about their illnesses without feeling ashamed about it. We also need to be very sensitive with regard to the terminology we use, which is also important, because I've had people who come and tell me that he's had two unsuccessful suicide attempts. I said, thank God he's had unsuccessful suicide attempts. I mean, we wouldn't want a suicide attempt to be successful. So there is nothing like a successful suicide attempt. He's either attempted suicide or he's committed suicide. So, people sometimes don't know the terminology. So even using the right terminology is very important. That increases sensitivity. So there are a lot of people who come and tell me, I have a brother who's schizophrenic, and I always tell them, you have a brother that suffers from schizophrenia. Mention it that way. There's a lot more dignity added to the illness than just, or don't say I have a dad who's alcohol dependent. No, I have a dad who suffers from alcohol dependence. It adds a lot more dignity to the entire illness. So there's that aspect also, which plays a role. And another very important facet that is there with regard to suicide prevention is we need to do a lot of anti-suicide work in the regional languages. India is a land of many languages, and I think we need to do work in Hindi, Marathi. We need to reach out to people. We need to reach out to people in other states. We need to look at socio-cultural factors in states that probably each state is very different, and there are some different socio-cultural factors in every state. So we need to reach out there. I mean, I remember there was a study sometime back that came up about a rise in suicides in Goa. Now, as an individual who stays in Bombay and goes to Goa for a holiday, I would think, why the hell would anyone want to attempt suicide in Goa? But probably there are factors in Goa, which are probably playing a role. We don't know. So we need to look at individual pockets and, try and see what is probably causing those things over there. I think it's also very important that, and I think that will be what also Nyana mentions in her talk, that we need to also educate families about suicide. So if you have somebody who's suicidal, please tell the family that it's important that you all get vigilant. Very often what happens is that the family thinks, "Arey nahi, wo bolta hai, wo aise nahi karega." That's the tendency, and I always tell people the conversion time between a suicidal thought and a suicidal act is a few milliseconds or even a few seconds. So one has to be very important to understand that the fact that someone has suicidal thoughts, to convert that into a suicidal act doesn't take time. So the fact that anyone has even passive suicidal thoughts needs to be assessed very importantly. So that's something which I think is very vital and very important. And this is something which I sort of want to drive home. We also need to probably advertise about suicide, which I don't think we do. I mean, newspapers don't advertise it. They generally publicize suicide, which happens, but they don't advertise suicide prevention. That is something that I think we need to do. We need to do that at train stations. We need to do that at airports. We need to do that at different places, which I think we don't have corporates who are willing to invest in suicide prevention. So we need to look at that angle as well. And generally, we also another aspect with regard to suicide prevention is, I remember we did a program some weeks ago where we have to look at media and how media sort of works towards suicide. So media should work towards suicide prevention, the way they report suicide, the way they talk about it, the way they publicize it. So that's something which also is very important, that they speak about it, and they speak about it in the right manner. And I think that's something which is very, very vital. Also, a very important facet of suicide prevention that very often gets neglected is teaching children and adolescents about suicide. A lot of people think, oh, if I go to an adolescent class in the 9th and 8th and I talk about suicide, probably they may get ideas, and they might sometimes, when they are upset, might try and attempt. But the answer is, you might actually prevent suicide from happening, and you should talk about it. That is something, and school teachers need to be sensitized, because a lot of suicide happens at a school and college level. And one area where I always say that we're always talking about school mental health, but somehow we're neglecting college mental health in our country. And college mental health is something which isn't spoken about. And I always say that you nurture the child till the 10th, and then you just leave him to the wolves from the 11th to degree college. That is something that shouldn't happen. College mental health has to receive full thrust. We need to have counselors in colleges. We need to have people, or we nurture him till the 12th and then just leave him to face engineering alone, or leave him to face medicine alone, or leave him to face IIT alone. So that's something which is not there. We need to have counselors in these places, and we need to have people who are trained. The more people get trained, the more sensitive they get, the more easy it's going to be to prevent suicide. Lastly, my last statement before I finish is that every suicide is preventable. I always say that every suicide is preventable, or was once preventable. Probably people didn't pay attention to it. If it got the right attention, we would have probably saved a life. And we have to see that, work together, I think, towards making India, I won't say the world, because we work more in India. I mean, I would even say Maharashtra and Bombay, because we work here. We don't travel to other parts of the country. We have to try and make our state suicide free. I mean, people come up with statistics that one suicide occurs every 6 minutes or 5 minutes in India, which, I mean, is shocking. An attempt. It may not be a completed suicide, but an attempt. There is another thing that came up, that around 13.5% of teenage suicides were related to social media, like Instagram and multiple other things. So this only shows the role. So digitalization, I mean, digital mental health has to be used also. I would say rational digital use also has to be taught. But most importantly, every suicide is preventable, and we have to work towards a suicide-free society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks a lot. That was a very insightful talk and a very lucid conversation here. Now, the time to listen to our next speaker, Miss Nyana Sabharwal. Nyana Sabharwal is a career suicidologist. Now, what is career suicidologist? You must have some quite a few people ask me what suicidologist is. So let me tell you guys, suicidology is a specific branch of psychology where they focus specifically on suicide research, suicide intervention, as well as suicide post-prevention model. Mental health as well as suicidology go hand in hand at many levels, but suicidology is very specific and talks about how the suicide as a behavior is seen as a continuum. Her focus area encompasses suicide prevention, intervention, and post-prevention. She's a founder of Safe Space NGO and is also the co-founder of We Hear You. She has done master in psychology and neurosciences for mental health from King's College London. She's invited expert in the Indian Association of Private Psychiatry Task Force for Suicide Prevention. She has lived experienced facilitator at the American Association of Suicidology. So, without further delay, let's hear from the expert. Nyana, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you, Dr. Avinash, for sharing that. It's such an honor to be speaking here. So I'm going to talk about suicide prevention a little bit from a suicidology approach, which is slightly different from and a different approach because it's the science of preventing suicide and the study of suicide itself. So I'm going to just start with something as basic as its definition, which is the intention of taking one's own life, because suicide is all about the intention. Whether or not the person chose to take their own life depends on the intent, and therefore many times you're left back wondering whether it was actually a suicide or not, and whether the person actually intended to die, or whether it was an accident, or whether it was whether there was actually a desire to cause oneself harm. And that becomes really the big part of the study that we do in suicide prevention. From a suicidology perspective, we actually work on some very core beliefs, right? We say that everyone who's thinking about suicide does not want to die. They want the pain to end. And this is really, I think we've talked about it and we've heard about it, that there's deep emotional pain that occurs, and therefore the person finds choosing to die much easier or possibly more acceptable than living a life of pain and deep excruciating emotional pain. They will consciously or unconsciously let you know. I know we hear that suicide, it happened, we didn't know, but 90% of all suicide have signs, and people will let you know, as much as, hey, I have thoughts of suicide, or they may say something or do behaviors or behave in ways that will say that something is out of the ordinary for that person. For example, they may say, nobody will miss me when I'm gone, and things like that, that are actually signs that we look out for when we are looking at suicide first response, or when we're looking at suicidology and suicide in a manner of which we can prevent it. If you know those signs, you can actually make suicide the most preventable death, because 5 out of 6 people will not die by suicide if they get the help that they need, if we're able to pick the signs earlier. And as Dr. Avinash said, that if we ask about suicide, are you thinking about suicide? When people do this, sometimes it means that they are thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? What we found in the US in studies, that 50% of the people that died by suicide were in clinical care, but they weren't asked about suicide. And so much of that can be averted if you're able to ask the question, even if it is somebody who is a friend or a family member or a loved one who may be sort of giving us these signs. So coming to kind of the language, right? And this fact that today mental health and suicide is still not talked about because of stigma. And one of the biggest things that we believe is that everybody is responsible for suicide prevention. Everybody at some point of time in their life is a first responder. And by first responder, I mean you're the first person who somebody may come and say, hey, I am thinking about suicide, or hey, you know what, days have become really hard and I may not want to be around very long. You could be a loved one, you could be a parent, you could be a spouse, you could be a doctor, you could be a physician, you could be anything to that person, but in that moment you are their first responder. And so our own attitudes and our own ability to respond to that really makes a big difference. And so language, as Dr. Avinash really pointed out, is a big part of us reducing the stigma around suicide. For example, not using the word commit because suicide is not really a crime, or for that matter, actually talking about suicide in terms of its, the act of doing a behavior that causes oneself harm with the intent to die. So what do we use it as? So We Hear You is a support group that runs for families who have lost loved ones to suicide. As Dr. Avinash pointed out, risk population, people who have lost loved ones to suicide, those families are a very high risk population, because the recent Grief to Hope report pointed out that almost 30 to 80%, which is an average of 60%, who lose someone to suicide, those family members go on to having thoughts of suicide or doing suicide behavior themselves. And this is a report that just came out, I believe, in 2020. So how do we actually talk about suicide with somebody and do it in a manner of dignity? So we usually say something as a person dies by suicide, or a person who suicides or does suiciding behavior. And every step of the way, we are either becoming conscious of our attitudes or our language, and we become part of the solution, or we somehow unknowingly or unconsciously continue to promote or allow stigma to occur in our own way. And today, I think suicide prevention is everyone's responsibility, because 1 in 20 will have thoughts of suicide. We know that, right? And if it does, and they will let us know, we might at some point in our time become a first responder, especially if it is that we are psychiatrists or we are in the space of mental health, or even physicians. We may hear a patient or a client talk to us about their thoughts of suicide. And in that moment, we not only are psychiatrists, but also first responders, which is the first people to respond to a crisis in that moment. So where does suicide come from? We've been talking about trying to understand where suicide comes from over the years, and suicidology has moved towards the trauma-based and a trauma-informed approach to suicide and suicidology, which is to say that suicide is also rooted in trauma, which is what we call early adverse childhood experiences, where more the adverse experiences you face, not only does it have an impact on the brain development, but it happens to have an impact on our serotonin and pathway, serotonin release issues. We have issues with our nervous system response. We're constantly in flight, fight, freeze mode, which is also called complex CPTSD or PTSD. And if you ask what is the long-term solution, actually globally, we're talking about parenting being the long-term suicide prevention in ways in which we can protect our children from early trauma. Where does it come from? Well, suicide is on a continuum. And as Sir said, it goes very quickly from no thoughts of suicide to thoughts of suicide. And we have talked about and we all know about the biopsychosocial model that we follow, and the biology being genetics, but also being epigenetics today, which we know that trauma in itself impacts your genes and it is intergenerational. So this actually passes down from generation to generation. What is trauma? Early childhood abuse, emotional, sexual, physical, living with a family where there is mental illness, living with addiction in the family, incarceration, loss of a parent, divorce, family separations. And the more we have in our list of trauma, the higher the chances of suicidality, mental illness, or psychiatric illness that comes. Psychological factors then takes that into consideration, where there may be, as Sir said, a risk population where there is a personality disorder, or there might be a psychological condition, there might be a psychiatric condition, there might be addiction, there might be other factors that Sir had kind of talked about in terms of psychological factors. Past history comes back to being matters of trauma. And current life events means that if I have already got a past history of trauma or of a mental illness and done past suiciding behavior, then I have lower resilience, and my resources today are probably not in the condition to able to handle, for example, a pandemic, fights in the family, loss of a job, lower financial, and these current events actually can quickly make a person go from no thoughts of suicide to thoughts of suicide. So suicide is on a continuum, and it, as we may believe that it is impulsive, yes, the act may be, but people go from no thoughts to behavior. So you don't go from no thoughts to the behavior, but the thoughts come in, and that's when people start giving out signs, and they go into planning, preparing, and doing the suiciding behavior. In first response, therefore, we don't use the word suicidal because we need to know where the person is on the continuum to able to get them the help that they need. And therefore, being very, we as first responders and in our training, as Dr. Suyog has done, we actually try to identify where the person might be and therefore get them the help that they need, because 5 out of 6 will not die by suicide if they get the help that they need. So what does a person doing suicidal behavior actually need? And I think this is a question when asked, everybody gives the most wonderful answers. They need to be heard. They need to be listened to. They don't need advice. We shouldn't be giving opinions. We shouldn't be telling them what to do. All of those responses come. And yet when we talk about listening, it becomes one of probably the most hardest skills that we found, to be something that people struggle with. And why? Because by design, we are used to fixing a problem, providing a solution, giving the advice, kind of telling people what wonderful lives they have, and therefore they shouldn't be thinking about suicide, or providing, a solution. And we've seen it, and I can see Dr. Suyog smile here because he's like, yes, I agree. Listening is probably one of the hardest things. But let's talk about listening a little bit, because listening is much deeper than just hearing what the person says. It is called the neurobiology of trust today. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit in the next few minutes about why that is such an important part of preventing suicide. Because when somebody does come in to tell us, there's some very fundamental things that happen. They're talking to us with trust. They're asking us for our help. If we go into the mode of what is wrong with you, or okay, I hear you, but let's see, can we talk later? Okay, just hang on, I will come back to you on that. What we're really doing is we're saying that our own body and our own ability to handle that conversation may not be there in that moment, and I'm not able to listen to you at this point of time. What we have to do through listening is we are creating trust. And trust is a neurological, neurobiological sort of process wherein I tap into yours as a first responder, as a person I'm talking to, nervous system, to calm myself down, and that is called co-regulation. And that's where trust begins. When I talk to you about suicide and you are able to calmly accept and say, thank you for telling me, I'm really glad you told me, let's talk about how we can get you the help that you need. We are building not only the co-regulation, which is my body and your body, which is the interpersonal neurobiology, are actually at the same rhythm. If I am anxious as a person who receives that information, unable to listen, I am actually probably creating more anxiety in the person who's told me about their thoughts of suicide. We then move into listening with safety, and safety is non-judgment, non-opinion, just listening to create connection. Right? Because safety is not the absence of threat, it's the presence of connection, and connection builds trust. It allows for what we call the third pathway of the brain, which is called the vagus nerve, and the social engagement pathway. We know about the hyperarousal, the hyperarousal, but what we have found today is that social engagement is where people agree to pause their behavior of suicide. That's where there is a window to allow a person to stay safe and actually recognize their options and choose life. And that only comes in the presence of safety, connection, and the neurobiology of trust and co-regulation. How do we achieve that? Well, it's really simple. It's through our facial expression, body language, and our tone of voice. We can say the same thing in several different intonations, and they would give several different responses to someone. By design, we are animals. We're wired for survival. We're wired to check for threat. And so if the person in front of us, our neuroception or our nervous system detects threat when I actually share my information of thoughts of suicide, and I'm not received with open arms and with yes, thank you, you told me, I'm going to get you the help that you need, let's talk about it, I will shut down, and the chances I will continue to remain in hyper arousal and continue to be in a space where I'm not getting the help that I need. Suicidology is really moved towards that space where we are talking about the neurobiology of trust, creating safety and co-regulation, because social connectedness and social engagement is what keeps people here, because theories say that we know about the helplessness, we know about the feelings of lack of belonging, we know the burdensomeness. How do we bring people back to stay connected, not just to themselves, but to society and family, and therefore to create a life worth living? Today's suicide prevention is not just about not dying. Today's suicide prevention is about creating a life worth living. And that is to focus on the person using a strengths-based approach in creating a safety net and connection through the neurobiology of trust. So that is my section, and that is what I wanted to share about suicide prevention and where what we know the move is. And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Sir, unmute, please.
Thank you very much for such a lucid explanation about suicide being rather than an impulsive act or a specific event, to be a continuum at various point of time. The different stages of suicidal thoughts happen to be with an individual, and a very specific thing about the language that we use. Attempt is something which is termed as a measure of we attempt exams to pass the exam, to succeed in exam. suicide is a tragedy. So people die by suicide or people suicide. It's not commit suicide as such as well. So a few questions from the audience. Um One specific question that I get is suicide helpline number. So I think Nyana can help us out there. Suicide helpline number. Do we have a suicide helpline number with safe space?
Safe Space does not have a suicide helpline number. We do interventions working with psychiatrists or with families or the individual themselves, but not as a helpline. We do it as an active first response. But we are working with other helplines to train their people in suicide first response.
And meanwhile, we at AIIMS Nagpur, we do have a mental health support line, which may be helpful for the individuals to reach out in case of distress. I'll tell you the number 0712, that is the pin code of Nagpur, 2352033. I'll repeat it once again. If you want to write, you can please write 0712 235 2033. Now this helpline works between 9 to 5. We are yet to be able to get it functional 24/7. As of now, this helpline is working during working hours only. And however, we are hoping to get it work 24/7. Another question that I get is identifying the suicidal ideation. I understand how to identify suicidal ideation in a particular individual. Some people going through a rough patch, where do we say that this particular individual has become higher risk for suicide as compared to the individual going through the same patch, not being high risk? So how do we do that? Nyana, do you want to answer the question?
So should I take it, sir?
Yeah, take it. No problem. Yeah.
So we would look at, as Sir has talked about, resilience, risk factors, and protective factors. So the same thing when two different individuals, we actually look at how many risk factors they have and how many protective. So we look at more the strength-based approach, the resilience, the cognitive ability, decision-making, and all of those factors. While both may have warning signs, both may have the same level of or similar level of distress. The one that has more protective factors, for example, family support, a strong, marital life, lower levels of trauma earlier on in life, does not have a mental health condition, or does not have any or from a risk-based population, are all factors that we need to look at in order to identify a person that might have a higher propensity to doing suicidal behavior than somebody who has probably, for example, higher protective factors will be at a lower propensity to doing suicidal behaviors. However, if the person has had, for example, two really important things or three things that people talk about is having had loss in the family by suicide, having done suicidal behavior in the past, and or addictions are important factors to take note as they increase your suicidality risk.
Thank you.
Avinash, sir, would you like to add, sir?
No, I think Nyana has answered it properly. There isn't, anything left there. The only thing is that, also another thing is that ask everyone about it. That's very important. Ask them, do they feel suicidal? That is rather than just assessing. See, there may be many people who have these risk factors but don't feel suicidal. There may be people who don't have these risk factors but still feel suicidal. So we need to ask everyone about feeling suicidal. That's important.
So, sir, you have talked about the high-risk groups, specifically the medical student, the engineering students, people with mental illnesses, people with chronic medical illnesses. And we also emphasize that if an individual comes for help, be a friend, be a subordinate, be acquaintance, we should ask about suicide. Now, many times, general public have some inhibitions to ask about suicide. They believe, how do I ask in a non-threatening way? So, do you have any suggestion on asking about suicide in non-threatening way, sir? Because many times,
Right. So one of the things which I always tell people is that you can, ask people, do you feel that, things would be better if you are not here? Do you ever feel that, if I go away or if I pass away, things will be better? Do you ever feel that it's better for me to die? You can start in that manner and then say that, have you ever thought that life is not worth living? Have you ever thought that you would want to end your life? And then if the answers are yes to any of these, I mean, then I would rather ask them that how seriously and how often have you thought about it? That would be my next question. And if they tell me it's comes once a day or 4 times a week or 3 times a week, then I would tell them, okay, have you, I mean, ever thought of what you want to do? So, is there like a plan that they have? And then very often, someone would tell me, yes, I did purchase a rope, but I didn't hang myself, or I did, bought some poison, but I didn't take it, and all these kinds of things. And then that gives you an idea with regard to what these things are. So, this whole issue is a good thing about a good way to ask, I think.
Yeah, thank you, sir. One more thing I want to ask is we talked about mental health in school population, and then we talked about not having and not putting enough emphasis on college mental health. So, invariably, what happens in colleges, specifically, I'm talking about medical colleges, since this particular event is directed towards medical faculty, is students are really not comfortable talking to their professors and their teachers that well. So, how do teachers be proactive and asking about their mental health as well as their suicidal ideation? And also
Well,
the neurobiology of trust that Nyana talked about, that may also come in handy here. But we'll start with you, sir. Yes.
okay, one of the things that I would want to say is that I have seen a lot of medical teachers who uh, probably put themselves on that pedestal that I am this associate professor, I am this professor. I mean, I'm sorry if I hurt anyone's sentiments over here, but I mean, I always say, you have to get down to the level of the MBBS kid who's there. I mean, you can't have this gruff stern face and say I'm this doctor who has seen it all and I know it. And of course you've seen it all, I'm not denying it, but the fact is that the more you see, the more you learn, and the more sensitive it makes you. So you have to get down to the level of this thing, in the sense, I've had instances where surgery residents or medical residents have spoken about being suicidal or feeling suicidal. And I've had a medical professor telling me that, do you think he's too weak to continue doing his masters in surgery or his masters in general medicine? And from that point of view, and do you think he should take a lighter branch, like say pathology, where he doesn't have to see too many patients? I mean, so sadly, they have stereotyped specialities, like for example, in Bombay we've seen a slightly larger number of suicides happening amongst anesthesia residents for whatever reason. Now at Sion Hospital, I don't know about other hospitals. So probably, I don't know, it's the overwork, it's the specialty, it's the access to the means of ending one's life. I don't know what might be the reasons. So we've even had instances where we've prescribed medication to medical students, and they've used those same medications as a tool to end their life. So this also happens. So it's very important that we have to first be very sensitive to the needs of the child. I mean, we can't just say, oh, he's going to be a doctor, so he has to be tough. Well, all doctors aren't tough. There may be some soft doctors also. So you have to understand that children come from all sorts, like even, I mean, even amongst our own specialty in psychiatry. I remember I had a student of mine who called me up and said that, so whenever anyone speaks about suicide, and so I get a little emotional because there was some family history of suicide in his family. He said, I have not witnessed anything. I've had an uncle who did it, and I was a little close to that uncle. So whenever any patient in our OPD talks about suicidality, I feel a little hesitancy. So is it that I'm too weak to take up psychiatry? So at that time, I mean, my approach to him is, you will interview every suicide patient. that comes, and you will build your resilience rather than probably thinking that you're weak to take up psychiatry. You will and I said, I will sit with you when you're interviewing and let's see how you feel. So that hand holding at times is needed, in the sense, I mean, I would love to have a medicine head of unit who tells a weak student. I mean, I'm not saying medicine head of units are bad, I'm just giving you a prototype, that who tells the weak student, fine, I mean, if you don't know anything today in your final ward exam, okay, you take 2 weeks study, come back, you don't fail a guy. I mean, I always say that, how can you fail someone that you send up for an MBBS exam? The fact that you sent him up means he's good enough to probably appear. You should have stopped him before the exam. Similarly, in a postgraduate exam, I mean, how can you fail someone? So I mean, I think, and failure is something that our students have to be taught to handle. I mean, I think what is not taught is the very sensitivity. Like, for example, handling your first death as a resident, handling your first error as a resident, handling, and wherein, rather than being told, oh, you've done this error, fine, you're human, the error can happen, you learn from it, but rather than being ridiculed, that you have to be, it has to be handled very sensitively. So these are things, I think, which are very, very important. And I think this is where the whole issue lies, that we have to have professors who are very sensitive to these issues. I mean, I will give you this example. uh, uh, I had a student who came to me who was doing gynec and was feeling depressed and suicidal, and doing MD gynec, and she went to the professor and said, I feel upset and I feel low and whatever. So the professor sent her to me, phoned me and said, see, Baba, I don't know, I have enough of deliveries, I don't want one more nonsense happening in my unit. I mean, so that only showed the lack of sensitivity. I mean, I would have loved it if that professor just held the student's hand. Of course, same gender, brought female professor, female student, brought the student to the OPD and said, Bacha, speak to sir, tell sir what is wrong with you, and we are here to help you. Just even just that one line would have, alleviated so much of anxiety. It would have reduced so much of anxiety that that student was probably undergoing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Nyana, you want to add to it?
So I don't think I can speak on the medical faculty at all, but I will just speak about human interaction, and that brings me back to bringing more compassion into care, right? And we are in the caregiving service. And so we all need to be more compassionate and create safety nets, because if we don't do that in our medical services or in any service, or we're not teaching empathy and compassion, which are the core to actually providing care and services. And as I shared earlier, that it is for me to able to share with you, and you look at general life, forget, students telling their teachers here, if I don't trust you and I'm afraid of you, I'm not going to tell you the truth. So if I have not created an environment of trust, and if I've not created myself as a person to be somebody who invites you to come and talk to me and say, I'm a trustworthy person, you can share and I will be there for you, I'm not going to come and talk to you. So even if you say, yes, go speak to your teacher, I may not be a faculty member. And I mean that across schools and colleges and, medicine possibly. I'm not going to be somebody who's going to be your confidant or somebody you're going to reach out to, because that's how, like we said, it's how our biology works. You walk into a room and you say, mujhe wo aadmi nahi pasand, pata nahi kyun. We sense it, that's neuroception. We sit in a class and we hate a professor. God knows he's never done anything to us. We still do. Now you're telling me go speak to him about your thoughts of suicide, or open up to him about your mental health. How many, and if we just go back to each one of us and we look at kids who come into our colleges and to our schools have come with a history, and that history may be trauma, that history may be loss, that history may be n number of difficulties that they have seen, and have probably taken a lot to get here. And what we need to provide them is encouragement and motivation, because that's the reward pathway of dopamine, right? What do we instill? We instill fear. That does not help us get people the help that they need. And so my conversation is really about understanding the neurobiology of human beings, is to create the physiology of trust in our institutions, in our schools, and in our colleges. And just because somebody is your teacher does not mean I'm going to want to talk to you. I may not even want to talk to my parents, but we talk to peers. And there's a lot we can do with peer support for sure.
Thank you very much. So I believe when the teachers are calmer, the teachers are open to listening, the likelihood of students telling the teachers their difficulties, the very threatening aura of a medical teacher goes away. But for that, a teacher needs to get down from that pedestal of I've been there, I done that. These are the small things. We've been dealing it for quite some time. We need to rethink our approaches towards the student. We need to re-evaluate at times what we think of ourselves, because that is what will be conveyed consciously and many a time unconsciously, because that's how we are structured. That is how our neurobiology is all about. So my sincere thanks to Nyana and Avinash sir. But one thing, we have somebody to thank us all on behalf of Department of Psychiatry today. So over to you, Dr. Sri Lakshmi. And thank you very much. This has been a wonderful discussion. I learned a lot from both of you, and so has our audience, I believe. Okay. Thank you very much, madam.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
sir.
Suyog.
Over to you, Sri Lakshmi.
Thank you, sir. And I'm here to extend a formal vote of thanks on behalf of the Department of Psychiatry, AIIMS Nagpur. And I would like to begin by giving my first thanks to our Director and CEO of our institute, Major General Dr. Vibhadatta Sena Medal. Madam is always a pillar of support for our institute and all programs that we organize. We had Dr. Mrunal Phatak with us, our academic dean, who was the chief guest for today and who gave such a beautiful start to today's program, I think, with a wonderful message on happiness, and which sort of set the path for the rest of the conversation. Our guest speakers who are still here with us, Dr. Avinash Desouza and Ms. Nyana Sabharwal, they covered such key and crucial points on something that everybody needs to know on a topic, I think, which is something that, you know, is very heavy on our hearts, but something that we can all do a little bit about. So I think very crucial and important points covered. So a big thank you to both of you for having taken time out and spent time with us today to be such an important part of such an important awareness. And of course, our dynamic chairperson, Dr. Suyog Jaiswal, who has effortlessly guided today's program. A special thanks to Mr. Sanjay Vade and Team Sun Pharma for the technical support, which has actually helped us run things so smoothly. And last but not the least, a big thank you to our audience for your patient listening and participation. We did have, I think, sir covered quite a bit of the questions that came in. So we hope to continue to have such an enthusiastic participation in future events as well. So thank you and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Avinash sir. Thank you, Suyog. Thank you, Sri Lakshmi.